Hey everyone, welcome back to another lecture here, and this is on our chapter about the biological stuff in psychology. And this is a really big chapter. In fact, I kind of combine the chapters on biology and neuropsychology into one chapter. Um, and so I'm not going to be able to go through all of it in a video lecture unless you want to watch an hour-long video lecture, which I don't think anybody does. So I'm going to basically talk about the brain. Um, And so there's lots of slides in this week's announcement. I think there's test questions about neurons, and I think there might be a test question about some of the other brain structures like the hippocampus. So make sure you look at those things and read about them. But I'm going to talk mostly about the brain. Um, our nervous system is divided up into two main uh, systems, the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. I'm not going to talk so much about the peripheral nervous system in this video, but you will want to read about it. But I'm going to talk about the central nervous system, mostly um, the brain. Okay, the spinal cord is also part of the central nervous system, but the brain is the main thing I want to talk about. And now your book talks about uh, the hindbrain and the midbrain and the forebrain. Um, I don't think of the brain in those terms, so I'm going to kind of skip through those parts because I think of the brain in terms of lobes. Let me see if I can find the slide here. All right, so here, lobes, okay? Um, and I like to draw when I'm talking about the brain. Now this works better when I'm in an in-class setting, but to draw a brain, and maybe you'll want to try this to help you think about it, you basically draw like a gigantic boxing glove. Okay, that's our brain. All right, and there's four basic lobes in the brain. There's the frontal lobe, which is here, as you might guess, at the front of the brain. There is the temporal lobe, which is kind of on the side of the brain, right by your ears. There's the parietal lobe, which is kind of along the back top part of the brain. And there's the occipital lobe, which is on the back of the brain, back of your head here. Okay, and each one of these areas of the brain, they are all interconnected, but each one does kind of something special. The frontal lobe at the front of our brain, right here over our eyes, is really involved in the things that make us the most human. Things like complex reasoning, uh, thinking ahead about, okay, I'm going to do something. I wonder what the consequences of that could be. That's this part of the brain working. And it's the last part of the brain to really develop fully, which is why teenagers do such stupid things, is their frontal lobe isn't fully developed, and so they don't understand the idea of consequences and planning. The temporal lobe over here on the sides of your head by your ears, no big surprise. The big thing there is auditory perception and recognition. So when we hear things, that part of the brain is activated, the temporal lobe. The parietal lobe, this one kind of on the sides and back in our picture, is really about movement. It helps us process movement. It helps us recognize things when we see them. And then the occipital lobe here in the back of our head is really about visual processing. So what that means is when we see things with our eyes, the back part of our brain is where most of that stuff is being processed. This is also why if you slip on the ice and bonk your head, you see stars. It's because you've hit your occipital lobe. And so those are the main four areas of the brain. That's how I think about the brain. And I'm sure there will be a test question about at least two or three of those lobes. Okay, the brain also has some really interesting areas on it. Let me draw another brain here. Okay, so I just paused and drew another brain. Some areas that I want to make sure you know about. Sorry, my cat's meowing at me. Okay, kind of along the top part of the brain here, there's two areas. You can see it on the slide, but you can also see it here. And one is the motor cortex, and one is somatosensory. Okay, one is motor, one is somatosensory. The motor cortex is a strip of brain that really controls our movement. It has places along that strip of the brain that correspond to parts of our body. So when I'm moving my hands in my brain, the hand part of the motor cortex is active. Okay. We also have, let me see, up here kind of towards the front, this little circle I filled in, it's on the front left part of our brain, is an area called Broca's area. Now, if you had brain damage in that area, that means that your speech would be very much affected. And I think in this week's discussion, there's a link to a video of a woman who has Broca's aphasia. That's what it's called when you have damage to that area. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. And then the other area that I want to talk about is kind of back here on the temporal lobe, where that's called Wernicke's area, or Wernicke's area if you're German. If you have damage there, that means your speech doesn't make any sense. And that's also called Wernicke's aphasia. And so I think there's test questions about those too. Let me try and find the slides here on those things, and we'll talk about them. Okay, the last part of this video lecture is going to be about things that go wrong with the brain. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of the slides for this chapter that I do want you to look at and read about. But let's talk about things that can go wrong. And this is what really relates to the second discussion this week. So if your brain's working fine, that's great, but sometimes things go wrong. You could have what's called a cerebrovascular accident, also known as a stroke. Most of us probably know people who have had strokes, and these can be either really severe and kind of disable a person for life, or they can be kind of minor and a person recovers in a day or two. Okay, this is where you have blood vessels getting blocked in the brain, so the brain doesn't get the oxygen it needs. You could have a traumatic brain injury, which has become much more well understood since our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. One of the, I guess, positive things that came out of those conflicts was doctors now know a lot more about how to treat traumatic brain injuries and help people recover from those. This is where you have a sudden impact and the brain inside the skull is kind of smashed against the skull, and then the brain starts to swell. So you don't want one of those. People get what are called neurodegenerative diseases, the most well-known of which is Alzheimer's. For your assignment this week, I'm going to have you watch about a half-hour video on Alzheimer's. That's really kind of, it's really good, but it's also kind of heartbreaking. And I think a lot of us probably know people that have had Alzheimer's or have Alzheimer's right now. And this is where in the brain slowly neurons just start to die out, become not functional, and then depending on the area of the brain where that's happening, you start to see functioning decrease. So in Alzheimer's, parts of the brain associated with memory start to degenerate, and so their memory gets really, really poor. Okay. All right, then there are some other things that can happen. You could have some kind of injury to your hippocampus, which is a brain structure really associated with memory. And if you had damage there, you might develop amnesia. And you can see there's different kinds of amnesia. The one we most often think about is a person can't remember their past. So there's a video that you'll watch this week where you'll see a guy who he can't remember things that happened even just a few minutes ago. And so that's amnesia. You could have Korsakoff syndrome, which is really the result of drinking too much. And there's a video this week of a guy being interviewed, and he seems to remember a lot of things, but there's other areas where he can't remember anything. And so the video on that's pretty interesting. Let me see here. You're going to see a video of a woman who has what's called visual agnosia. This is when you have some damage to a visual part of the brain, and you will see a man asking her to do things or describe things she's seeing, and she can't do it. And there's another video of a man the woman's trying to get him to describe looking at a combination lock, and he can see it, but he doesn't know what it is, even though he's an adult. So there's some videos there where you can have impairments in the brain. And then, like I mentioned, there's the aphasias. Okay, so if you get damage to your Broca's area, front left part of the brain, you would get Broca's aphasia. Again, there's a video for this. This is where you lose fluent speech. So the woman in the video you're going to see has this really hard time getting her words out. Okay, so you'll see that. If you have damage in Wernicke's aphasia on the kind of left side of your brain, you can talk a mile a minute, but it doesn't make any sense. We call it word salad. And so you're going to see this older woman who has this just going on and on and on and on, but what she's saying doesn't make any sense. And dementia, I already kind of touched on. And so I think that's all I'm going to do for this lecture. And like I said, in the discussion, you'll have some videos to watch. In the assignment, you'll have a video to watch. And if you have any questions, you can sure email me. Otherwise, I will talk to you later.